Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series. And this one I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the Eastern Open. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I had quite the scare against an untitled player rated only 1900 and was really quite fortunate to walk away with the draw in what I consider to be a losing position. Now, my opponent in this one was actually also another entitled player, this time by the name of Cheung. And again, it was an extremely young player, this time only 12 years old, with a FIDE rating that, was quite low. But again, you never quite know where these young players are at in the States because, again, they do not have enough FIDE games under their belt to accurately depict or describe their rating. And so, yeah, I knew I had to be on high alert again so that I wasn't at risk of the same kind of letdown that I experienced in round 1. Now, I did have the white pieces this time, so I was hoping to put some more pressure from the jump on my opponent and then kind of see what happens. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, I'm with the move d4, which is kind of typical for me. Ryan played knight f6. And then I went knight f3, and I think kind of my approach in this one, and you're going to see it at least from the early part of the game, was just not to take any crazy chances, just to try and play kind of solidly because, and the last game I tried to play maybe a little bit too ambitiously at some points and got punished. And one of the things that you need to realize a lot of times when you're playing people that are lower rated than you is just to kind of remain cool, calm, and collected and allow them to kind of make the mistakes that they're naturally going to make playing someone that is much stronger than them. So in many respects, you kind of want the game to come to you, and you don't necessarily have to force the issue entirely, and that's something that is important to think about. Now, my chess in general is not really a forced issue type of chess, but it's a lot of times about picking your spots about when to force the issue, and I didn't do that well in the first game, so I was hoping to do that better in this one. Anyways, after knight f3, black played e6, and now I played e3, which obviously I've employed quite a bit over the course of the year. Mainly earlier in 2019, I was doing this type of stuff with e3 and bishop d3. And one of the things I liked about this is you kind of get a position that, is not going to be refuted necessarily, but is going to just be playable. And a playable position when you're 400, 500 points outrating your opponent is something that you should be happy with. Now, obviously, we saw that, I employed this setup a bit too much in the closed tournaments that I'd played in. And, certain players, titled players, caught on and found the right antidotes against it. And so it wasn't something that I could do game to game because it just wasn't challenging black in the opening. But in an open tournament where I'm playing someone that really does not have time to even look at my games because the pairings come up 2 to 5 minutes before the round starts, all of a sudden these types of systems become more playable. So I decided, why not, give it a go again. So anyways, after e3, black played d5, Ryan played d5, and now I went bishop d3, and then bishop e7 was played. So Ryan's opting for the kind of Queen's Gambit declined approach against this system, and we'll see what happens from there. I castled. Black castled, and now I played the move b3, and this is kind of the idea in this system, is that you play the bishop to b2, you typically play the other knight to d2, and then you play for c4, and you have your bishops training on those long diagonals against the black king potentially, and you also try to restrain white's pawn, or you try to restrain black's pawn break. So, obviously e5 is pretty well restrained, and if c5, you're actually opening up the diagonal for the bishop on b2. So you kind of ask black whether they want to do that. Now, after b3, Ryan played the move b6, and I think this is actually a really good move. And the idea is that you're preparing c5 yourself, and if I wind up taking on c5, the argument is that you're going to take with the b pawn and actually have more control of the center. And really, you just prepare the bishop's development to b7. So you keep all your options open. After b6, I played the move c4, and part of the reason I did this is I was not so sure I should be very enthusiastic about positions after bishop b2 and c5, because what I learned from playing this structure earlier in the year is that usually the side that is able to initiate their c-pawn break first is the side that's actually controlling the center. And then if you don't initiate it, then you wind up being the side that's kind of defending and playing around the center. And the reason for that is if I played a move like c4 now, black can effectively resolve the tension as they wish. So black can now go c takes d4, and if I go for a move like bishop takes d4, there's knight c6, which is not so great because now my bishop is attacked. And if I go knight takes d4, there might even be e5 now, because now I can't go back to f3 with my knight because e4 is a annoying fork. So essentially, that kind of dynamic led me to playing c4 first because I thought, you know what, I want to get in that break first. I want to be the one that controls the center. And now if black played c5, I would be the one that'd be able to take on d5 first and resolve the play there. And none of the pieces that black has at their disposal to actually take on d5 is completely ideal. If you take on d5 with the e-pawn, you have these hanging pawns that might be a little bit unpleasant, and you might even have an isolated pawn later if c takes d4 is played. If you take with the queen, it might be a target because of knight c3, or even sometimes e4 is a tactical option. And if you take with the knight, this is typically the most solid, but you're actually dragging the knight away from the protection of the h7 pawn, so sometimes tactically that can be an issue. And also white sometimes has e4 pressing onward and attacking the knight in the center with tempo, which can allow white to develop some type of initiative. So basically, that's kind of the dynamic that exists with this pawn structure. So anyways, after c4, Ryan actually played the move d takes c4, and I actually think this is 100% the correct choice because you pretty much seeding the center to some extent, but you're actually playing for the structure. And the point is that if I play bishop takes c4, this bishop on c4 is really biting on granite. It's not really doing so much on this diagonal, and this position really becomes akin to a queen's gambit accepted position, where there's a d takes c4, bishop takes c4 sighting, and the pawn structures are relatively symmetrical, and the c and d pawns will ultimately come off the board at some point when black goes for c5. But again, I think the point here that's important is this bishop will need to be redeployed because it's not doing anything on this diagonal. So typically I have to go back to e2, and that waste of time actually allows black to equalize with bishop b7, knight bd7, and c5. So I didn't really want to go for a position that was that dry, so I decided to play b takes c4 and justify my my pieces, but also just my central control, because here it appears that I have a nice central pawn chain. I might have my bishops both eyeing these diagonals, and I thought this is kind of a nice dynamic way to play. But it's not without its risks, because now Ryan played the move bishop b7, and essentially what he's preparing is the move c5. And the point is that once c5 comes in the game, white is actually the one with the hanging pawns, and black is the one with the long-term trumps as far as the pawn structure is concerned, because at any moment black can go c takes d4, e takes d4, and actually have 2 pawn islands to white's 3, and then also sometimes get counterplay on the c file, with the rook coming down to c8 later. So I do have to be kind of aware of the long-term strengths in black's position and the sort of the long-term weaknesses on my own. And that means that all of a sudden the pace of the play has kind of shifted a little bit to one where I was kind of waiting for things to develop to something where I kind of have to force the issue a little bit. And this is not something that I loved, actually. I don't love having to force the issue, but I did feel like I understood this position and the dynamics in the position decently enough to be able to do that well. So I started with the move bishop b2. And my idea with bishop b2 is just to line up that bishop on the long diagonal and, kind of be ready for the move c5. Black now played c5, not a huge surprise. And now I played the move knight b d2. Why is that? Well, I thought the knight would be better on d2 rather than c3 for two reasons. First of all, I thought that the knight here does a nice job of covering the f3 knight as well. And in some positions, it frees my queen on d1 to move. There are certain structures where bishop takes f3, g takes f3 is okay, but it's also nice to be able to just take with the knight and not have to worry about that. So that's the one reason I like knight d2. The other reason is I'm not blocking my bishop on the diagonal here. So the knight on c3 would do that, and I feel like its position would only be completely justified if I'm able to push through with d5, and I didn't really see that being realistic. Last but not least, there's actually a third reason. In some lines, it's important that my rook is actually connected to the pawn on c4 just so that it's protected, because there are certain scenarios where black might build up pressure on the c4 pawn with rook c8, knight c6, and knight a5, and sometimes even bishop a6. And with my knight on c3, my rook is in the way. Or my knight's in the way of the rook. So I just wanted to be a little bit more solid, and I thought that was the way to go. Note that in both squares, c3 and d2, the knight does a good job of covering the e4 square, which is a very, very important square to control. So anyways, after knight bd2, black played knight bd7. I think that's actually a really good choice to keep the tension here. Part of the reason for that is because white doesn't really want to take on c5. In fact, that'd be a terrible move, because if d takes c5, now knight takes c5, not only would the bishop be under fire, white would also have split pawns on a2 on c4, which would be weaknesses, and would have further control over the e4 square. So this is definitely not something that you'd want to allow. So instead of that dreadful move, I played the move queen e2, which connects my rooks and, essentially, gets my queen off the back rank and, entertains some plans in the future. Now, you can also argue for the move queen c2, but that's not so great, because even though you would have a battery against h7, you'd be lining up your queen against an eventual rook coming to c8, and so that's not something you'd want to do. The computer actually advocates the move a4, and this is actually a move I considered because the knight is on d7 instead of on c6. There's no knight b4 idea challenging the bishop and keeping the knight kind of unassailable on that square. But the reason I rejected a4 and didn't wind up playing it is because I didn't like the move a5. I thought that even though my a pawn, maybe is quite decent here, and I took some space, I thought that it could be a target in the endgame to something like bishop c6, and I just didn't love my pawn being fixed on a light square and not being very mobile. So I didn't want to do that. Although I recognized that if a5 wasn't played, I might have the potential to go a5 myself and kind of undermine black's pawn chain. So anyways, after queen e2, Ryan played the move c takes d4. An argument could be made that you didn't have to rush with that one. You could have gone rook c8 or even queen c7, but there's nothing wrong with c takes d4. It just didn't need to be rushed. But anyways, after c takes d4, of course I played e takes d4 to keep control of the c5 square still and keep my pawns intact. And I was kind of okay with this development just because now the position is more open for me. I do have these hanging pawns, but now I have the e-file to work with, which can be favorable tactically. I have the bishop already lined up. This one has the potential to be opened up at any moment with a d5 break, and I thought that I might have some attacking chances in the next 5 to 10 moves, but I'd have to be quick, and that was kind of my thought process. After e takes d4, black played the move queen c7, which is a good move, getting the queen off of the back rank and connecting black's rooks. And in some lines, actually entertaining the move queen f4. Now, if you saw the tournament I played in, the Washington Chess Congress, there were a few games in that tournament early on, or actually not early on, in the middle rounds, against Vincent Say, and there was another there was another youngster I played where basically with white and black there was this theme of queen f4 or queen f5, basically shifting the queen towards the king side and also sometimes generating some threats. And here it's funny, another queen pawn opening where that's the case, where this f4 square is kind of sensitive. The reason it's kind of annoying is because if the queen is able to shift to f4 and then maybe to h6, the king feels more secure. But the other dynamic at times is that sometimes it just kind of slows down any initiative that I was trying to build up. So it's a square I really have to be on the lookout for and just kind of consider from time to time. One of the things that's kind of annoying is that if I try to cover this square with a move like g3, I open up the whole diagonal. So I didn't really want to create that type of long-term weakness. I'd actually done that before in a game way back when, earlier this year, against Brandon Jacobson, in which I played g3 while black had a light-squared bishop, and I was extremely lucky to draw it because the weaknesses were just nearly too much to bear. So I wasn't going to play g3 here, but I was aware queen f4 is an annoying move. And for that reason, I actually thought black was actually completely fine here because I didn't feel like an attack should work because black's pieces are all pretty well placed. But I decided to try anyway and played the move rook c1. So the idea with rook c1 was to actually line the rook up against the queen, and then in some circumstances, maybe amplify the effects that a move like c5 or d5 would have if tactically the rook would get uncovered. So that was the idea there. After rook c1, black played the move rook fd8. And I think this is actually a slight mistake and essentially the case of wrong rook. Because actually the position before rook c1 had been played a few times before in the database, believe it or not. And rook d8 here, rook fd8 rather, was the first new move in the position. We're going to talk about why this is a mistake in a minute. Well, you're going to see why it's a mistake in a minute, but I'm going to show you what I think is the best move, and it's the move actually rook a d8. And the reason this rook is actually better on d8 is because you give some security to your e and f pawns, particularly the f pawn, that you wouldn't really have if the other rook moves to d8, because then only the king would be guarding it, and that actually becomes a huge factor when white's actually trying to attack here. So really that case of wrong rook is, it happens quite a bit, and I think this is a case here. Now, the position is not spoiled or anything. Black is still fine, but it did give me some optimism that all of a sudden this f7 pawn is just a little bit more sensitive than it was a move ago, and in turn that means the e6 pawn is a little bit weak as well. So because of that, I decided to play the move knight g5. And knight g5 is a move I was actually considering in pretty much every position anyway, but it's something I felt a whole lot more confident would work with the rook, the f rook on d8. So all of a sudden here I have some threats. Knight takes e6 might be an idea, and then the bishop might be under some fire. So there's all of a sudden there's some tactical ideas in the position that are kind of dangerous. So anyways, after knight g5, black should have played the move queen f4. And maybe this shouldn't be such a surprise because I mentioned how important the f4 square was earlier. And a line could have gone knight df3 and h6. And I could still try and go for these sacrifices with knight takes e6. But they don't hit as hard here because all of a sudden the queen has counterplay on this side of the board. So even though it appears I'm 2 pawns up temporarily with queen takes e7, now black all of a sudden gets their own counterplay with bishop takes f3, g takes f3, rook e8, queen f7, knight f8, d5, and queen takes f3. And then there's these queen g4, queen f3 repetitions that happen all the time in lines like this. So pretty much that queen coming to f4 would actually keep me honest and prevent me from kind of like going in completely with these sacrifices. I could also try the move knight h3, challenging the queen, but you can see that when my knight goes to h3, I'm dragging it away from the business squares on the king side. So the queen would actually be able to move, and then I have to play a move like f3 to keep the queens on the board. And this type of position where the queen is all of a sudden in the vicinity of black's kingside pawns really ensures that black is going to be kind of okay. Note that a move like knight f4 is met by queen h6. And again, that queen f4, queen h6 maneuver I was talking about is quite strong. And while it didn't happen all in one go here, actually black managed to play queen g4 to actually create a weakness before actually getting to h6, which is great. So black's actually okay in these positions as well. And I could play g3, and the position is still very tense. Note that the queen only has one square in the position to go to, so it's relatively out of play. I still have a space advantage, but if you trust the computer will say that black's position is fine here, and I agree. Although I do think it'd be a little bit easier to play white. So anyway, that was kind of the key, this queen f4 move, because instead black played the move bishop f8, and this one is just a little bit too passive. After bishop f8, I played the move knight df3, and now you can actually genuinely see a real storm cloud brewing, because if you play a move like a6, just a move that kind of passes the baton, I can just go knight takes f7, and you have all of a sudden these really nice windmill mates connected to knight g5, queen takes e6, and then I'm sure you've seen this in the puzzle books, queen g8, knight takes, and knight f7 mate. And that's actually the kind of stuff that happens when e6 and f7 are sensitive and the f rook has moved to d8. So all of a sudden I have these very, very not so subtle tactical shots on f7, and the position is actually getting quite critical. Now, the computer actually also considers the move f4, and I actually considered this move as well, but I didn't want to basically risk compromising my king's position too much, and I thought maybe weakening this diagonal would be a little bit too risky, because I wasn't sure if after h6 my attack would crash through. Now the variations are fascinating, so I will show them, and after the move h6 I can actually just play knight df3 and ignore the fact that my knight is attacked on g5. And the point is that if you play h takes g5, I play f takes g5, and all of a sudden the rook on f1 can get into the action. And so it's kind of ill-advised to move the knight, because if you play knight g4, g6, bishop takes f3, g takes f7, king h8, and g takes f3. And remarkably here, black is still a piece down, white is still a piece down, because white essentially lost two pieces for the moment. But g4 is hanging, this pawn f7 is strong, and the king on h8 has no move, so a check on the h file is going to be mate. And after a move like knight h6, this position is still kind of a mess, although it's a mess that black should probably survive. So yeah, so all of a sudden there are some real tactical ideas in the position, but I didn't feel that I was hitting home, and it was a little bit too risky for me to play f4 if I didn't see lines that were forcibly going to win the game, because by playing f4, not only do I weaken the second rank, I also weaken this diagonal, I weaken some squares in front of my king, and just a lot of weaknesses, and for not enough return. So instead I played knight df3, which carried the more simpler threats, if you will. Now here, black actually blundered, and I think failed to realize just how dangerous the threats were on both of these squares, because I think most people can see the knight takes f7, knight takes f7, and knight g5, and queen e6 windmill type stuff I was showing before. But maybe knight takes e6 is not something they can that's as acknowledged. And here my opponent played the move h6, which is actually a losing move. Instead, again, the best move in the position is actually queen f4. And it's very similar to the lines from before, where the queen being on f4 gives black the ability to kind of attack and defend. And so here, queen c2 is actually the best move, guarding h7. And yeah, after g6 just covering, I still have some pressure on the e6 pawn, but nothing quite crashing through with mate. And again, if I move my knight from g5, black will take twice on f3 and always be threatening perpetuals. So not the easiest position in the world, although the computer gives crazy lines here with d5, knight c5, and bishop e5, which look like white's completely winning, but turn out to be kind of tricky. And I'll just leave. I'm just going to show you the rest of this line just to show you how crazy it is. But essentially, the computer evaluates this as, I think, like +1 for white, because even though black is the two bishops and white is a pawn down, the queen on h5 is quite precarious, and there's some tactical threats with knight takes f7 right now. But I think it's kind of a mess and pretty much anyone's game just to get to this particular line. I do think white's moves are a little bit easier because black's queen is in a little bit of a tough situation. But you can see how queen f4 was the key. Instead, after the move h6, it actually just runs into the move knight takes e6. And this move actually just loses, because the problem is that if you play f takes e6, I actually can go queen takes e6 check, and I don't have the g5 square for my knight anymore. But after king h8, I can actually go to h4, and I have the g6 square. And all of a sudden, these windmill checks in conjunction with the bishop on d3 are just decisive. One example, if you go bishop d6, I can just go knight g6 check, and after king h7, I don't even have to rush with any like checkmating shot. I can just go rook ae1. And remarkably here, the king is completely locked up. I always have discovery windmills, and I can get my rook in the game with decisive effect to either the h file or through the e file. It's just not going to hold up for black. So yeah, just a totally winning position. And if you try to stop the king from being totally boxed out with the move g5, now after knight g6 check, king g7, the black king does have the g7 square, but I can actually just play d5. And in one fell swoop, I shut down black's bishop on b7 on this diagonal, and I open up my own. And black can actually hardly move in this position because the knight on d7 can't move because the f6 knight would hang. The knight on f6 can't move because it's pinned. The queen on d6 can barely move, and our square on c7 can barely move, and just the tactics here are just massive. And white's also just threatening a move like f4, ripping open the f-file and bringing the rook into the attack. And so black would not last long in this position. And after rook e8, I could play the move queen f5. And from f5, I'm still putting pressure on the f6 knight, but also can move my knight on g6 away and invade on that square. And so this position is also completely lost. So because of that, knight takes f6, essentially black's in a really, really tough spot, and black decided to try and play the next best thing that keeps the game going, and it's the move bishop takes f3, which actually forces a series of trades, because now I don't want to play g takes f3 because that ruins my structure and then gets rid of one of my attacking pieces, that knight that was actually going to come into the game afterward with knight h4. And so I'm actually forced now to trade to an ending where I'm a pawn up and I have the two bishops, but there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's technically winning as well. So it changes the game from being a direct attack to more of a conversion type of game. But frankly, I'm more at home when I'm trying to convert anyway. So I didn't mind this transition. So after bishop takes f3, knight takes e7, and bishop takes e2. Bishop takes e2. Note I did not take on a8 because then black would just play bishop takes d3, and the rook on f1 and the knight on a8 would still be hanging, and black would be for choice here. So instead I played the move bishop takes e2. And yeah, essentially we can kind of just pause here, and you can see that white has 6 pawns to black's 5 pawns, and white has the 2 bishops. So that to me typically constitutes a winning advantage. So it's really just a matter of technique here to bring it home. So black played the move rook a8, challenging my knight on c7 and getting out of the way of knight takes a8. And this was actually the first question for me, and I thought for some time here about whether to put the knight on b5 or on a6. Why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out where you would put that knight, because I think this is actually a really interesting question and kind of goes into the element of, you know, how to convert, what's the best way to convert. So it's actually, I think, a good question to solve. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out, you know, which square you might consider putting the knight on. The best square to put that knight on actually is b5, remarkably, and I didn't do it. I played the move knight a6, and I thought the reason that knight a6 was good is because I would slow up the black pawns, and I thought that blockading them here, fixing them on dark squares, my knight also doing a good job cemented here. I thought that would be annoying for black, but the point is that if you play knight b5, you actually invite the a pawn forward, and it becomes more of a target on a6. And so after a6, even though your knight is forced to leave and go to c3, the a6 pawn is more of a target there than it is on a7, and that's why it's better. I just thought my knight on c3 would be a little bit awkward because I didn't see any squares it can go to next that were attractive. Of course, e4 is not great because the knight's here, and d5 would give me double pawns. So I just did not like the knight blocking the rook's protection of the c pawn, but it turns out that knight b5 is a better move. I wonder how many got that. So anyways, after knight a6, black played g6, and this is actually a pretty good move because now black's trying to get this bishop on the long diagonal and get some counterplay against my hanging pawns. And again, this position is winning for white, but it's not totally clear because black does have some counterplay based upon the fact that these are hanging pawns, and my bishop on b2 will be unprotected. So if this bishop gets to g7 and is the protected bishop on this diagonal, again, when bishops are trying to oppose each other on diagonals, it's typically the protected bishop which is more secure, and I had to be a little bit concerned about tactics as well. So after g6, I played the move bishop f3 now, trying to kind of get some counterplay of my own, trying to win an exchange with bishop b7. And now black played knight b8, and this is another good move, getting the knight off the board and stopping this bishop b7 idea. Because now, if I go bishop b7, black can at least start with knight takes a6. So I actually played the move bishop b7 here, and this actually turned out to be another mistake. Instead, it would have been better to take the knight on b8, just because after rook takes b8, the rook is more passive on the b file than on the c file. Of course, it has no prospects here, and yeah, it just is. It would have to waste time going back to c8. Now, I thought that by playing bishop b7 and forcing the rook to c7, this is actually what happened. I thought that this would be nice because now the rooks were actually split. So I thought it was more valuable for the rooks to be split on the 8th and 7th ranks rather than to have the rook for just one move be passive on b8. But the issue is that in the process of trying to get the black rook split, I actually ruined the coordination of my pieces a little bit, in particular the bishop on a6. It's actually kind of out of play, and it's not controlling the important squares in the center that it was controlling before when it sat really nicely on f3. In fact, on f3, it was dominating the black knight. On a6, it's hardly doing that. And that's why this whole sequence was not very good. After rook c7, I played rook fd1, and I thought, okay, I'm going to overprotect the d pawn before bishop g7 comes. because I was already concerned about scenarios where there was bishop g7, knight e4, and all of a sudden my d4 pawn becomes a bit of a target. And then tactically, with the bishop on g7, there would be knight c5 ideas, taking advantage of the fact that after d takes c5, the bishop on b2 would be hanging, and there'd be opposite colored bishops, which would at least increase the chances that black could make a draw. So yeah, I was already a little bit annoyed that there was no real direct way to convert, and I had felt that I'd kind of missed something in the process, because typically a bishop pair, pawn up, these types of positions can be converted a little bit easier. After rook fd1, black did play bishop g7, and I played the move king f1 because, I was wary of knight e4 and some pressure on d4, but I thought it'd be nice to just bring my king to a light square and actually also control my back rank problems by giving my king an escape route via e2. It actually turns out that the better move would have been f3, just covering the e4 square right away. And the point is that after knight d7, this is another move I was worried about, getting to c5, and that way I could play bishop b5, and after knight c5, actually go bishop a1, and I kind of neatly defend my bishop because now it's protected by the rook on c1, and if black actually plays knight b7, I can now play a4 and start to improve my position further. But again, I still feel like this is not the desired conversion or the best conversion rather, because the one with the bishop on f3 seemed a lot cleaner. So anyway, let's back up. After king f1, black played the move knight e4, and now I played the move f3 anyway, just challenging this knight on e4. And now black played the move knight d6. Now, the thing that I was actually looking at and thinking about was actually knight c5. And to be honest, I was actually kind of concerned about this move. I was going to play bishop b5. I wasn't sure entirely. Oh, no, I wasn't. I was going to take on c5. Yeah. So basically, after knight c5, I'd calculated now that I can actually take, and that this type of ending would be very good for me because I can play the move rook d6. And I seem to be netting the b6 pawn because there's no way to defend it right now. And I thought that even though they're opposite colored bishops and I'd have split pawns, I thought with the presence of rooks on the board, this should be a winning endgame. The computer's not so sure. It goes bishop e5 and then takes on h2 and actually does not give white a winning advantage here. But I just have a hard time believing that this is a draw because my pawns are very quick, and after a4 and a5, I can advance extremely quickly. But perhaps black has some miracle counterplay here. Maybe some maybe some rook e1 or rook e7 and bishop g3, rook e1 mate ideas, maybe, but I'm not buying it. So anyways, after knight d6, I now actually had an opportunity to kind of break the game open because black actually, again, has some threats with knight d6. Now I have to be worried about knight f5, and on f5, not only is the d4 pawn attacked, also knight e3 check, forking the rook and king is also a problem. So I recognized here that I had to be really, really careful, and I thought that, I should just kind of nip that in the bud with the move g4, which I played. It turns out, though, that there was a tactical solution that I actually missed, and it was the move c5. And the point is that after knight f5, I actually can play c takes b6, and the idea is that I invite knight e3 check, or knight e3 in general, because if knight e3 now, I can go king e2, and the rook is still hanging, so that doesn't really do very much. But after rook takes c1, bishop takes c1 amazingly holds everything together. And the point is I'm covering the e3 square, and now the b pawn is actually a factor. So if you take on, if you don't take on b6, I'm going to play b7. So a takes b6 actually required. And then here after d5, white is actually still a pawn up with the two bishops, and the transition hasn't gone too poorly for white because Black's still kind of, trying to find the counterplay, but hasn't managed to win a pawn or anything. So c5 actually would have been a better way to kind of control things, but I would have had to see that knight e3 check isn't really a problem, and I can just play c takes b6. Instead, I played the move g4, and this move is actually kind of risky because even though I'm covering up the entry squares for the knight temporarily, I'm also kind of opening up the second rank and weakening my king just a little bit. And even though the queens aren't off the board, there still are plenty of pieces on the board, and Black could have actually gotten some counterplay here. But fortunately for me, Black played h5 and really kind of opened the position in a way I was hoping for. Because after h5, I played h3, just kind of holding the fort down on g4. And after h takes g4 and h takes g4, Black played the move f5, which is actually a losing move. Now, I'd kind of counted on this move f5 as not being a possibility, and I'd seen why White could kind of take advantage of that. So it kind of begs the question, what could Black do instead? And it turns out, and again, I did not see this at all, it turns out that Black has the very good move b5. And the idea is that if bishop takes b5, amazingly, again, this would be super tough to see over the board, but amazingly the move rook b7 is just remarkably strong. And the point is that the bishop on b2 is unprotected, and so you're actually threatening to play a6 and actually just win a piece. Or if the bishop moves away, you're threatening to play knight takes b5. And positions like bishop a1, knight takes b5, c takes b5, and rook takes b5 are all of a sudden extremely difficult to win because the extra pawn that I have now is isolated, and I don't have the advantage of the bishop pair anymore. And it's actually Black that is extremely active here. And an argument could even be made that White's king is actually more exposed than Black's king here. And so all those factors actually make this position not very clear. And so I could play rook c4, and now Black can play f5 because there's no light squared bishop. There's no pressure on the diagonal. And we could have some scenario like this where, White is actually still much better, but it's definitely not a simple conversion anymore. So amazing resource, b5, and then after takes, rook b7. Now the other question is after b5, what if c takes b5? Because now it seems like, isn't White just up 2 pawns for nothing? Well, the idea is that actually after knight c4, all of a sudden the bishop on b2 is hanging, and there's a knight e3 fork threat. And White would need to play b6 here to tactically keep things together. And after knight e3 check, king e2, rook e7, the position is a total mess because there's discovery checks here trying to win an exchange. There's also the b6 pawn hanging. And when the dust settles, b7 is a key move. Knight c4 check, king f2, knight takes b2, rook d2. If White finds all of these moves, White is actually still significantly better. But it is super hard to find any of this stuff over the board. And this type of position would still require some work to actually convert. And so, it would just be really, really tough on White to really get all of this stuff right. And just really remarkable tactics starting from b6, king e2, b7, king f2. I mean, just remarkable stuff. And then rook d2. What a move. Just chilling, just not panicking at all. A piece down temporarily, but White's threatening rook c8 and queening the pawn, so that's why White doesn't really care. Note that a move like knight a4 loses on the spot to rook c8. So, amazing line. Didn't wind up being played. I don't think it was seen by either of us. So instead, after this hg4 sequence, Black played the move f5, and this is a move I was really happy to see, and I kind of recognized that this move was probably not very good. And the reason for it is now this king is actually quite unsafe. And the reason for that is because of this diagonal. all of a sudden the light squares on this diagonal are wide open, and I still have my light squared bishop. So I was thinking that tactically I must have some possibilities of playing c5 and bishop c4 here. And it's amazing how quickly the position turns when the bishops had some squares to operate on. Because after f5, I first played the move king g2, just tucking my king off of the f file for a moment. I thought the king was really safe on the g file. Of course, the g file wasn't going to be opened anytime soon, and I thought just that bit of prophylaxis was effective. Now, it turns out that c5 right away is actually extremely strong. I can show you a line here. After b takes c5, rook takes c5. Apparently, this ending is actually quite promising for white. But I thought that the presence of opposite colored bishops here and the idea that the pawn on the d pawn could actually be blockaded by the dark squared bishop actually would give black good drawing chances. So I didn't really want to go for this. So instead, I just went king g2 and was a little bit more patient. And after king g2, black played f takes g4, and here I was like, oh wow, he's also opening the f file. And after f takes g4, I really believe that the king on g8 now is weaker than the king on g2 just because I had this bishop pair. And now the f file and potentially the h file could be open for an initiative against this king on g8. So black now played the move knight e4, I think trying to, maybe play knight c5 and take advantage of the pin on the bishop on b2 still, and some of the pressure on the dark squares. But I think he kind of failed to recognize that the king was actually kind of weak here, because now I very quickly played the move c5. And the point is that even if black takes this pawn and just wins it for free, this bishop c4 check and the power of the two bishops would all of a sudden come to life, and I thought a deadly way. Black now played the move rook f8, trying to at least get a threat on the f2 square. But I think it begs the question, what if b takes c5? Well, if you take on c5, I can go bishop c4 check, and if king h7, rook h1 check, and things kind of go downhill quite quickly. And if you go king f8, I can still go rook f1 check, and note you can't block with f7 on f7 because I can take it. You also can't block on f6 with the piece because I can go g5. So if you go bishop f6, g5 wins, because if knight takes, then rook takes f6. And if you go bishop, well, you can't go bishop takes f6 because you're pinned. And then if the king runs to the e file with something like king e8, well, then rook e1 does the trick as well, because now the e4 knight is dropping. And if you go rook e7, there's bishop b5 check, and now the king is actually just kind of trapped. So really, really problematic, and yeah, just a winning position for white. And so, yeah, after rook f8, I went bishop c4 check anyway, but the king essentially has no security, because after king h7, I played rook h1 check. Yeah, it's just a tough spot, because bishop h6 is again an only move. And now I can play the very quiet but effective move rook c2. And this little sneaky move rook c2 attacks and defends. It defends the f2 square from rook f2 check, picking up the bishop. But it also uncovers the c1 square so that I can add more pressure to the h6 bishop. And then the other problem is that you would love to play the move g5 and kind of nullify the pressure on this diagonal. But when you do that, you open up pressure on the other diagonal for the light squared bishop. And so this is why I love bishops so much. They just can do so many things together, and it's tough to corral both of them when they're working together. Black now played b takes c5, and remarkably here, the material is equal, but you can see it really doesn't matter, and the activity of the pieces is everything. And now I just played the very simple bishop c1, and it's just all gone. After g5, this was actually played. Now I played bishop d3, and now a new diagonal is opened up, and this one will win a piece for white. Black played rook e8. I played rook e1, now just training my eyes on the new target. And after rook ce7, I played the move rook ce2. And yeah, I expected black to resign now, but black played c takes d4, just one more move. And now I played rook takes e4. And here, my opponent finally resigned. Note that the discoveries here actually force black to trade on e4. And after rook takes e4, I can actually just take all the pieces off the board. And I have 2 remaining pawns, which are enough to win the game. So essentially, the king goes to g7. I can just go bishop b2 and actually pick up d4 right away. And if you go to g8, well, I probably would play bishop d5 check, and just to force the king, force the king back. Or actually, maybe no. Maybe even consider king f3 first. But the point is that if the king comes in, I'll give a check. If the king comes in again, I'm going to corral the d pawn. And well, I'm just a piece up. So having these 2 pawns is enough. And once I corral the d pawn, I can even trade the bishops because yeah, I just have 2 pawns. So anyways, after rook takes e4, Ryan had seen enough, and I won the game. Not the smoothest game for me. There definitely was a little bit of a hiccup in as far as the conversion was concerned. I did not play all of the best moves there, but I did take advantage of the 2 bishops when I needed to, and I alertly gave up a pawn to try and get the maximum activity that the bishops really needed. The opening was also not so great. I played my d4, knight f3, e3, bishop d3 setup, but you can see that the hanging pawns are only they're only a short-term asset and they're a long-term weakness. And you could see how if that attack did not crash through, I would have had some structural issues. Fortunately, it did, and that ultimately is all that matters. But it's a reason why I can't employ the setup all the time, because it's not actually that good. Yeah, that is what it is. Anyways, thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.